turning our attention to NFL, we are like less than 10 days away from the return of the American football NFL season. I'm delighted to say Cian Fahey is with us. Cian, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. We're 7 days away, I believe. I'm trying to avoid saying who that very difficult voice to guess is. I'm just going to want to blurt it out in there, you know.
That's all right. I think everybody, we've made that one relatively straightforward for people this morning. It's the 21st anniversary of the handshake?
Yeah, 21st, 2001.
Yeah.
Something you'd forget is how pivotal Roy Keane was in the goal, which you'd actually, like, I think Yapstam just kind of fell out of the way, and it's like, that was...
Cian comes on and says, I'm trying very hard not to say the name.
I'm trying to avoid it, yeah.
CIAN. Yeah, sorry. I think everyone knew anyway.
Cian Fahey, good morning to you. How are you?
Moving on.
Nearly 9 o'clock.
I'm good. You said it's less than 10 days. It's 7 days away from the NFL season, but I think the NFL is unique in the sense that it's been 8 months since the end of last season. The last season is longer than the actual season itself. So even this last week is going to feel like forever because the running is so difficult, so long. It's like I can't wait for it to actually start and get going.
The bit that happened over the last 3 or 4 days was that the massive training rosters that they had gets cut down to 53 men. So you're allowed to have 53 and then you're allowed another practice squad you can call people up to. But the 53-man roster is actually really important. Loads of very famous players have been cut over the last week or so, which kind of gives you an indication of the strength and depth of some of the different teams. Was there anything specific that stood out to you there before we get into the quarterback carousel?
No, I think the big story, it's the way it works every single year. Like I said, the off-season is so long that you can kind of get changes in the sport without getting like transfers or players playing with new teams, because the beating they take during the season and then the carryover of aging for 8 months means guys can very quickly go from being really, really good players, so they're known names, to suddenly being not physically able to stay on a roster anymore. The one that kind of stands out, though, and the big story from this preseason is Kenny Golladay, because he's that wide receiver for the New York Giants, and he's probably the highest paid wide receiver at one stage, or he was at the one stage, and he was given this massive deal to go to the Giants and be the star wide receiver from the Detroit Lions either last year or the year before. And they just want rid of him, and they can't get rid of him because of financial aspects, or if they did, they took a huge penalty to do so. And Golladay is this incredible athlete, incredible wide receiver, incredible talent, but his effort has been criticised there, I think unfairly at times, but his fit has also just been a major problem. And that's something you find in the NFL. Like, you have to have the right scheme fit, you have to have the right fit with the right quarterback if you're a wide receiver especially, and then you have to be physically able to sustain through all the beatings you take. It's why the average length of careers there is less than 3 years. It's why players fluctuate so much. A guy like Odell Beckham can go from being a superstar generational talent, has an ACL tear, and now suddenly he's just on the free agent market and not be able to get a job because physically he's not where he needs to be.
The player that you want to start this quarterback conversation around is Tua Tagovailoa. He's the Miami QB, a lefty who suffered a horrific injury in one of his final college games, and that has essentially put him behind the 8 ball ever since. Now, they've got a new head coach. They've got an incredible investment made in supporting cast. And so, therefore, you would say it's all set up for him to succeed. Are you a Tua-non? Are you a Tua truther? Do you think he's going to make it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to commend you on the pronunciation of his second name, because even I don't go that far in trying to do it properly. Tagovailoa, it's supposed to be, but that's not far from the way it's spelled. Tua is fascinating because Tua, you mentioned the hip injury. He had the hip injury at Alabama. Tua played as the starting quarterback at Alabama, and what that means is he was the pinnacle of college football at one stage. He was the best, or one of the best players in high school, so he was a superstar prospect. And then he destroyed his hip, and he has a hip now that you think would be like a 60-year-old or 65-year-old normal person's hip because it dislocated. That's not a normal injury. It's not something like an ACL that you see all the time. So he still comes out of college and comes out of Alabama and is a really high pick for the Miami Dolphins. They're desperate for him to be the franchise guy. He's the best thing that they think they're going to get for the last 20 or 30 years since Dan Marino. They have all the highest of highest hopes for him. And now he's entered the NFL. He's played 21 games. He's playing against the 1% of the 1%. And he's not only doing that at a difficult position, he's doing it at the most difficult position in sports, which is a quarterback, because you have to master everything about the position or you're not going to be even effectively good at all. And the real story about him is he's doing all this while throwing the ball with his wrong hand. Tua, when he was a child, his father taught himself as a coach, and he taught himself as a bit of a visionary, and he said, if my son controls ball with his left hand, that'll make him stand out more. That'll make him more valuable. So he's actually right-handed, but he's played his whole career throwing the ball with his left hand. And it's a weird thing because you can actually see it in the way he throws the ball. He's not natural throwing the ball at all. He's not comfortable throwing the ball at all. He's done it well enough to reach the NFL, which is an incredible achievement. But he also has very, very little arm strength. His passes often just die in the air. And this is why over the last 2 years, the first 2 years of his career, they've always thrown the ball very, very short. They haven't been able to push the ball downfield. They haven't been able to hit tight windows. He hasn't been able to drop back in the pocket and rip the ball into a closing window the way a Justin Herbert can, or a Josh Allen can, or even a Lamar Jackson can. But he has been effective enough that the Dolphins still believe in him. And besides that, they brought in a new coach, like you said, Mike McDaniel, and he's going to an offense that pushes the ball downfield. He's going to an offense that relies heavily on intermediate throws, which is 10 to 20 yards downfield, and deep shots, which is more than 20 yards downfield. More often than not, he takes a deep drop in that offense as well, so you can add 10 yards to any throws he makes. So if he's throwing the ball 25 yards downfield, it's probably going to be a 35 to 40-yard throw more than likely. So he's now in a position where he's going to make these throws, and they've invested huge amounts into Terron Armstead at left tackle, one of the best left tackles in the NFL, or at least he was when he was at the Saints, and the big story of the year, Tyreek Hill, Patrick Mahomes' number one receiver, who is built to go deep, and he's built to play with a quarterback who has a huge arm. And it just doesn't seem like it's going to be a good fit. I think it'll work to a degree because the offensive scheme there is a perfect fit for Hill, and they'll get guys wide open for Tua to throw the ball to. But at the end of the day, they saw it with the 49ers, and ultimately your quarterback has to make difficult plays, especially in the playoffs. And Jimmy Garoppolo couldn't do it when he wasn't being carried by the scheme, and I don't think Tua will be able to do it when he's not being carried by the scheme as well.
Okay, so ultimately that might end up doomed to failure, and they'll be on the market next season for a new QB. Somebody who has been on the market, you mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo there, he will be backing up Trey Lance in San Francisco. They cut his salary by $16 million, and he's sticking around. He's only going to be earning $6 million to sit on the bench and carry a clipboard, so not bad work if you can get it, unless he's going to start at some point in the next few weeks or a couple of months.
Well, it's one of the best jobs in the NFL or in sports, is to be a backup quarterback, because you can never play and make $6 or $7 million a year, $8 million a year even, and Garoppolo's getting to do that now, and he has a no trade clause, and he has full control of his future. From the 49ers point of view, it's not ideal. It's a problem. It's a multifaceted problem, because one, you expected to get some return for him. There was talks of getting a second-round pick even for him at one stage. That was always a bit outlandish. You're still probably hoping that someone gets injured and then he'll waive his no-trade clause and you can get something back from him during the season. But then it's also disrupting you, because you kind of wanted Trey Lance to be there and Trey Lance to be your next guy, and you can just fully focus on Trey Lance. But now Jimmy Garoppolo's always going to be standing there. He's always going to be a picture of him behind, and as soon as he has a bad game, there will be a section of the fan base that's like, Jimmy G was great, Jimmy G won us games, let's bring Jimmy G back. And Trey Lance is the polar opposite to Tua, in that he came through college without being a superstar. He wasn't a highly thought of prospect in high school. He wasn't a highly thought of prospect coming out of he was actually, sorry, he was a high pick in the draft, but he wasn't necessarily a celebrated player. He was a developmental player. He's a freak athlete. He's got a huge arm. He can run all day. He actually, ironically, reminds me a lot of Colin Kaepernick, who the 49ers jettisoned famously or infamously all those years ago. And now he's got an opportunity to play with Kyle Shanahan, who is a similar system to what we were talking about in Miami, where they're going to get wide open receivers, they're going to get him easy options, and all he's got to do is execute on a base level technically to do that consistently, and that'll allow the whole offense to prosper because of how physically talented he is. But from what I've seen of Trey Lance, I'm not 100% sure he's going to be able to do that. Like I said, the offseason is really long, so he could have developed a lot over the last 8 months. He could have developed a lot over the last 2 years while not starting. But the glimpses of him that we've seen have not really been exciting. Have not really been, oh, this guy looks like he fits. He looks like he belongs. He looks like he's going to easily take on this this league and become a superstar. But I guess the argument against that then is you guys like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, who at the start of their careers looked like they didn't know what they were doing, and then eventually it clicked for them, and that's what the 49ers are hoping. I think I didn't really mention it with Tua. I should have mentioned it with Tua. He's the most important player for the whole league, because the Dolphins are set up to be a Super Bowl contender if he plays well. But if he doesn't play well, the whole team will completely crash. I think you can say similar about Trey Lance. The 49ers aren't at their peak talent-wise, but they have a good coaching staff and they have an overall amount of talent that's really, really high. So if he hits even to an above-average degree, I think that team becomes a force in the NFC West. And it combines with the Seattle Seahawks completely falling off. They look like they're going to completely rebuild. They're starting Geno Smith, which is an insane thing to do in 2022. And Arizona Cardinals, who are dealing with DeAndre Hopkins being suspended and who are having their own infighting with Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury. So I think those two teams in their division are probably going down, which leaves just the 49ers to challenge the Rams. And the Rams coming off a Super Bowl, teams tend to struggle a little bit coming off a Super Bowl, and the Rams are a relatively young and inexperienced team. It's not like they've won 3 and 4 Super Bowls. They know what's coming up. They're going to experience new things this year they haven't seen before.
You mentioned him there. How good is Josh Allen?
Josh Allen is one I famously kind of have issues with calling him a superstar and stuff like that. He's a freak athlete. He's as much as you call him.
It's okay sometimes to admit you got it wrong, Cian. Don't worry. It's a sign of your development as a human being.
Double down.
No, so here's the thing for me. I think so when he came into the league initially as a rookie, he was a complete and utter disaster. Like, physically couldn't throw the ball, didn't know what he was doing, running all over the place, falling all over himself. And I think he's developed to a level with his accuracy that's become above average, become very acceptable, become quite good. But the one thing I'm still wary of, and it's the same thing that happened with Carson Wentz and with Garoppolo to a degree, he plays behind an exceptional offensive line. And when the offensive line plays to that level, you don't see a quarterback in the most difficult circumstances all the time, which you see with other players. So I think Josh Allen has become one of the better quarterbacks in the league. I think it's an incredible testament to his development. It's an incredible testament to what he's been able to achieve. But I still think it's premature when people compare him to a Patrick Mahomes, compare him to a Tom Brady or an Aaron Rodgers, or the very, very best quarterbacks in the league. But I mean, he's still young. He's still developing.
26,
he can still be that superstar.
His progression is such that you would expect him to be able to get there if he continues at that level, notwithstanding the point about the offensive line. So let's see what happens.
He also has to be put in that position, though, because if it happens eventually with everyone. Like, Derek Carr has kind of been found out a little bit over recent years. He started his career behind a phenomenal offensive line, but to keep a phenomenal offensive line, you need 5 players. Offensive linemen are as difficult to find as quarterbacks, but you need 5 of them who are high quality, and you need 5 of them who work perfectly together. So teams never keep them for more than like 3 or 4 years.
Or you need an amazing coach, which doesn't seem to be too many of those around.
Somewhat personal question, which is probably irrelevant. What is going on with American football in New York at the moment? How are they both effectively 200-1 to win the Super Bowl? How have the Giants become so bad? The Jets are always like, it just defies belief that the Giants could be in the wasteland that they're in.
Pretty much everything starts with the owners. You've got Woody Johnson in New York, who is famously a good buddy of Donald Trump, so you can understand how he runs his businesses. And I don't really need to explain further with the Jets. They're a complete and utter travesty. They tend to draft a lot of players who everyone else kind of scratches their head and goes, why did you pick them? That doesn't make any sense. So they've had these decision makers at the top who just don't, like, who are happy to take money and not really incisive thinkers or thoughtful people or innovative people is what I was trying to say. They also have a tendency to go for what they call a football guy, which is generally just a guy who is old and gives out and complains about things and likes to talk about getting dirty and running the ball and that kind of stuff, which is just an antiquated way of building football teams. It doesn't work anymore. The Giants have had similar issues with David Gettleman. Since Eli Manning retired, they haven't really moved past that era. And David Gettleman came in, and he's since gone, but he literally, at a time when Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill and all the small players in the league were cutting up the league, he came in and said, football is about having the biggest guys. So he just kept drafting these big, massive offensive linemen and defensive linemen, and every team would just run around them and run past them and make it easy on them. And they've also tied themselves to a quarterback called Daniel Jones, who is not good enough. But it's kind of fascinating. In the NFL, it's best to draft an awful quarterback or a great quarterback. You don't really want to draft a below average one or just a bad one, because you'll always be able to convince yourself that, we'll make it work with him, even though it's very clear you're not going to be able to make it work with him. And that's kind of where the Giants are right now.
You're in purgatory. Very quickly, Russell Wilson, is he the new Peyton Manning? Got to go to the Broncos and win?
As in, how quickly do you want this? Can I just go no?
Okay.
I can explain it a bit further, but like, the Seahawks didn't get rid of him because they were moving on to something else. The Seahawks got rid of him to reboot because they looked at him and saw, he's an athletic quarterback. He's been really, really great for us. But he's also someone who relies on his athleticism primarily, and he's getting old, and he's not necessarily taking a lot of hits, but he plays in a certain way that's not going to age well. So I think they'll be very lucky if they make the playoffs in that division. If they were in a different division, they could be a playoff team. Okay. But they've got to compete with Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, even the Raiders, who are rebuilding a little bit. Okay,
quick 30-second answers. Marcus Mariota in Atlanta, good or bad?
I think this is one that's really going to surprise people. The Falcons over-under for the year is 4.5. I think they easily eclipse that. Mariota's a really, really good quarterback, and they've got a bunch of talented pieces in there. Mariota's another one who's a great backstory that we could go through it in a longer way in a different day. But he kind of was brushed out of Tennessee after being a star early, and then found himself in a bad situation. Then went to the Raiders as a backup for 2 years, and now he's trying to restart his career.
Okay, so he might actually flourish there. Matt Ryan in Indianapolis, is he washed?
I think he is, but like we just talked about, the Colts generally set the quarterback up for success. Good offensive line play, good scheme play. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one, and it's a soft division. The Texans aren't going to be good this year. The Jaguars are never good. The Titans, I think, are regressing a lot because they lost A.J. Brown. They lost Johnny Smith the year beforehand. The pieces there are slowly eroding away. So I think they're in a position where they're very likely to make the playoffs, and he's got Jonathan Taylor there as one of the stars in the league right now, which will take a lot of pressure off.
And then the last one is, you mentioned the Jags. Trevor Lawrence in year 2. What's going to happen there?
Ooh, that's a hard one to talk about in short detail, because he was in an insane situation last year where his head coach was going around kicking people and calling people out and embarrassing them, and that was his first year in the league. So I think there's a reset button for him in year 2. He's a good athlete again. He's got a big, strong arm. I think technically he's lacking some qualities that he's going to need, so hopefully he's able to show them off. If he shows them off, most people think he's going to be the next superstar. So if he takes that step forward, and year 2 is generally when quarterbacks do, so he could be an interesting one to watch more than someone we know a lot about yet.
All right, Cian, good stuff. Thanks a million. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.